This passage spoke to me in my daily readings this week, and felt like it was something that I needed to share with you today. So we'll go back to the Sermon on the Mount next Sunday. Lamentations chapter 3. Chapter 3. You can also follow along on the screen behind me if you'd like. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He has led me and made me walk in darkness and not in light. Surely he has turned his hand against me time and time again throughout the day. He has aged my flesh and my skin and broken my bones. He has besieged me, surrounded me with bitterness and woe. He has set me in dark places like the dead of long ago. He has hedged me in so that I cannot get out. He has made my chain heavy, even when I cry and shout. He shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with hewn stone. He's made my paths crooked. He's been to me a bear lying in wait, like a lion in ambush. He has turned aside my ways and torn me in pieces. He has made me desolate. He's bent his bow and set me up as a target for the arrow. He's caused the arrows of his quiver to pierce my loins. I have become the ridicule of all my people, their taunting song all the day long. He has filled me with bitterness. He's made me drink wormwood. He has also broken my teeth with gravel and covered me with ashes. You have moved my soul far from peace. I have forgotten prosperity. And I said, my strength and my hope have perished from the Lord. Remember my afflictions and roaming, the wormwood and the gall. My soul still remembers and sinks within me. This I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. Through the Lord's mercies we are not consumed, because his compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I hope in him. This is God's word. Well, that's a happy passage, isn't it? You know, we've all go through grief, things that we that hurt our souls. And if you haven't gone through catastrophic grief, it's just a matter of time before you will. When we suffer loss, it's natural for us to grieve. And in our emptiness and sorrow, it is normal that we focus, at least for a while, inwardly. But if we focus too long inwardly on our own pain, it starts to take on a life of its own, and we can see that pain scar us even deeper. If our attention continues to be directed inward, we will eventually lose our perspective on life, and we will lose hope. Life will become a confused mess of phrases like, if only I had ... I remember when. If I knew then what I know now. And why did this have to happen to me? Why did this have to happen to her or him or us? And we have these conversations in an internal dialogue, and sometimes guilt and bitterness and self-degradation permanently scar and ruin our life. And the question comes is, where is God, in this time? Where is he? You ever been in a dark time like that? I know you have. We all have. C.S. Lewis felt as if his life were coming apart at the seams. You know, he was a bachelor until his middle age, and then he found the love of his life, and he got married, and not long after they were married, just a short time, she found out that she had cancer. And he prayed and he prayed and he prayed and he begged God, but his new wife died, and he was devastated. He was already a renowned theologian and critic of literature and world famous for the Chronicles of Narnia and other of his writings. He was devastated at the loss of his wife to cancer. And part of his healing process is he wrote a book called A Grief Observed. And he said there were times when he felt as if the heavens were silent. Listen to what he writes. When you're happy, so happy that you have no sense of needing him, so happy that you're tempted to feel his claims upon you as an interruption, if you remember yourself and turn to him with gratitude and praise, you will be, or so it feels, welcomed with open arms. But go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. You may as well turn away. Where's God? What do you do when it gets like that? When the door bolts? You get busy? You know, when your heart is so heavy, do you just get busier and busier and busier and hope that the busyness will distract you enough that you don't feel? Do you eat more ice cream? Do you gamble? Do you binge watch a television show just to keep everything at bay and you just focus on something else? Do you complain to your friends? Do you numb your pain with alcohol or drugs, even prescription drugs? Do you abuse those to somehow medicate this sense of loss and sense of emptiness and feelings of abandonment? Maybe what you're experiencing is too vague to describe as grieving the loss of a loved one or a career. Maybe there's just something about your soul right now that you do not understand, but it's just dark. I want to say two things by way of introduction that might help you if this is your place, or one day it will be. Number one, do what Jeremiah did. So you have 5 chapters in a book called Lamentations. What Jeremiah did when his world went dark is that he wrote it out. He talked about it. And so do what Jeremiah did. Either write it out or talk it out. I found this quote by Dawson Trotman. You've heard me share it before. Thoughts disentangle themselves when they flow over the lips and through the fingertips. And this is what he's done in 5 chapters in his journal that he's allowed us access to. He's talking to God. He's praying his pain to God. He's yelling his pain to God, see. So do what Jeremiah did in some fashion. Secondly, listen to what Jeremiah teaches in this chapter. Towards the end of our time together, you're going to see 3 timeless truths that help Jeremiah get out of the pit. So listen and respond to what Jeremiah actually did and what he says. I was talking to a man this week about this particular passage. And he told me of a time when he was a young man, mid-20s, in the 60s. And during that time, he was going to seminary and he was trying to grow his life in Christ. And so he was a part of a Bible study that had determined that they were going to study the Scriptures together and they were going to hold each other accountable for their walk with Christ. And in the course of that discussion about Christ, the leader of the group sensed something in this man that wasn't quite right and asked him about it in a loving way. He said, there just seems to be a backstory to you. And this man said, I started to tell them about the fact that when I was 12 years old, my father died. So I grew up without a father. And I love my dad. I miss him. And then to take the void of the loss of my father, my mother turned into some other kind of person and became overbearing and manipulative and controlling and overprotective. And so what I found is that I started to resent my dad for dying. And then I resented my mom for her overprotection and control. And then I started resenting God for letting all of that happen. So the little group said to him, have you ever talked to God the way you've talked to us today? He said, oh, no, wouldn't dare. They said, well, we recommend you do. Do you have a place that you can get quiet and no one can interrupt you and you could just tell it like it is to God? And he said, well, I drive in my car several times a week to seminary to study the scriptures, a 60-mile drive. I'm by myself. They said that'd be a good place. So he started doing that. And he said, and he's choking back tears when he was telling me this week. He said, I started to tell God how I felt about him. How I felt about him taking my father, and how I felt about what my mother was doing to me and my family, how I felt about him being silent during this whole process. I just started yelling at God. And he said, and I even said some bad words to God about where I was. And he said, over the days and then the weeks that came, more yelling, more being honest with God, he said he just felt as if there was a presence in the car with him. A sweet presence. And he said, right then is when I felt like a window opened into my soul. And I felt the comfort of God. I wonder if Jeremiah is kind of heading this direction. Jeremiah is upset at what he's going through and what his people are going through. He had watched them as they walked away from their love affair with God and started to worship the gods of the neighbors. And when they started to worship those other gods, he was supposed to tell them about the dangers of that, and he did. But they ignored him, and the heavy hand of chastisement came down upon the people of Judah. And they were being disciplined. And what's bad about being disciplined is sometimes you experience the discipline of other people. Look at verse 1 of chapter 3. I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. The word rod is a Hebrew word for club. I'm the one that's seen God club us because of our disobedience and our rebellion against a monotheistic lifestyle. And I'm pretty certain that that's not what Jeremiah did. I'm pretty certain that Jeremiah did not worship other idols, but maybe his neighbors did, and maybe somebody in his family did. And because it was widespread, God then began to chastise the people of God, and when that happens, even Jeremiah felt the weight of the consequences of that chastisement. Does that happen today? Of course it does. Parents divorce, and the children feel the weight of that consequence. A pastor sins against a church, and there are people in that church that feel the weight of the pastor's sin. A church sins against a pastor, and the pastor's family carries that consequence and that scar for the rest of their days. You can't get away from the consequences. Jeremiah may not have committed any false worship. He might never worshiped an idol. But he's feeling it. I am the one who's seen the affliction And he talks about it. He says in verse 3, surely he has turned his hand against me, time and time again throughout the day. Have you ever felt like God has turned his hand against you? Now, while Jeremiah didn't directly sin, people did. And it kind of ratifies the truth that we learned from the old poet John Donne. Do you remember what John Donne said? He said, no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, the part of the main. If a clod washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sin to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for whom? For thee. We are all in this together. You think that your sin doesn't affect anybody. It affects people in your world. And Jeremiah is feeling that right now. Look at what he says in verse 8. Even when I cry and shout, he shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with hewn stone. He has made my paths crooked. He's been to me a bear lying in wait, like a lion in ambush. He has turned aside my ways and torn me in pieces. He's made me desolate. This is Yahweh talk he's talking about here. Yahweh's just ripping me to pieces. Verse 14, I have become the ridicule of all my people. Their taunting song all the day. I can imagine as a preacher, his congregation coming to him and said, we thought you said we were his chosen people. We thought we were his covenant bride. And this is how he treats us? Why do you preach messages like that when he clearly is spanking us and disciplining us? You're a laughing stock. You're a joke. Verse 15 says, he filled me with bitterness. He's made me drink wormwood. He also has broken my teeth with gravel and covered me with ashes. You moved my soul far from peace. I have forgotten prosperity. This is not a happy day. Not for Jeremiah, not for Mountain Heights Baptist Church. It's just, why did I come to church today to hear this? I had a man come to see me not too long ago about his marriage from another state, about his marriage and his ministry. And that's what happens when you get to be, I guess, my age. Some of the younger guys say, can you help me? And so I said, sure. And so I spent some time with this guy, and I asked him to tell me his story. And he said, the church is about to fire me, and I need to get some help. My wife is a mess. In fact, she's the meanest woman I've ever known. And I said, really? The absolute meanest? And he said, yes, she is angry and she's mean. I met her, and he's right. She was pretty rough. Preacher's wife, And I said, well, tell me what happened. And sadly, when you hear her story, you understand. As a junior in high school, she had been sexually assaulted. She came home and told her parents about it. Her parents did nothing. Her brother found out about it. And her brother then sexually assaulted her. And that caused a downward spiral in their family and in her life. Then this preacher's wife and this preacher started dating. And it was a rocky relationship. They fought. They didn't get along. They fought. They made up. They didn't get along. Finally, they decided they'd just get married. They went to one preacher, and the preacher did the premarital counseling and said, I'm not marrying you. They went to a second preacher. They did the premarital counseling. The preacher said, I'm not marrying you. You don't need to be married. Finally, they found a third preacher that agreed to marry them. And so they got married. And then on their honeymoon, on the second day of their honeymoon, through sobs, she said, this is the biggest mistake of my life. He wanted to be a minister, so he started working with youth in student ministry. He moved from that one position to another position. He bounced around from job to job. Finally, a little church that could not get a preacher for anything settled on him and asked him to come be their preacher. And when she came to church, she was the last one in, sat in the very back, put a purse beside her here to protect her from everybody around her, and she was the first one to leave. And she told him every day of his ministry, I hate being a preacher's wife. I hate being a preacher's wife. I hate being a preacher's wife. So I said to him, well, tell me about your interior life. Are you hearing from God? He said, I haven't heard from God in years. Really? He said, I talk to God only in public. When they call on me to pray for the offering, that's my prayer life. I said, well, what about from the scriptures? He said, I only read the Bible to get a sermon. Then I said something I probably shouldn't have said, but I said, has anyone ever told you you talk a lot? He said, what? I said, you're a non-stop talker. And when you're talking, it's hard to hear anything from anybody else. I said, I'd like to help you, but I'm going to make a recommendation that you take a day and you spend it alone and you never say a word. He said, that would be hell. I said, well, then what are we going to do with the scriptures that teach us that Jesus time and time again withdrew alone in a desolate place with his Father? He says, well, that was Jesus. I can't do that. I said, you're going to need to do that. And then I brought him to this text. Look at what it says. Look at verse 28. And when I read this text to him, his eyes brimmed with tears. Verse 28 of chapter 3. Let him sit alone and keep silent, because God has laid it on him. God laid it on Jeremiah. God laid it on my brother that I was trying to help. Because of rebellion, because of his own lack of pursuing an intimate relationship with God. And do you know what happens when Christ followers get disciplined by the Lord? You know what we most likely or most often want to do? We want to run away. We want to get away from the pain. That makes sense, right? You feel a pain, you pull away from it. And when the chastisement of God comes on our life, we pull away from that. We run away from that pain. And then we complain often that God seems so distant, which is kind of ironic, don't you think? It sort of reminds me of the couple that had been married for 25 years. This is back in the day, you know, when you would date and your date would sit right beside you in the bench front seat. They don't even have bench front seats anymore. Remember when bench seats were popular? Go like this. All right, remember bench seats? Okay, because, you know, your grandkids have no clue about lots of things, but especially bench seats, right? So, but you remember when you dated, where did she sit when you were driving on a date? She sat right next to you, right? And she started to complain. She said, how come we don't love me anymore like you used to? We used to sit so close together when we drove down the highway. And he said, I never moved. That's sort of what God does, right? God doesn't move. We come to him and go, how come you don't talk to me anymore? How come I don't hear from you anymore? And God says, I never moved. How come I don't feel your presence anymore? I didn't move. I know you. I'm right here. You're still important to me. And then we read the most beautiful words that must have warmed the heart of the people, as they did my friend who came for help. Verse 21, look in your Bible. This I recall to my mind, therefore I have hope. Now the this he's referring to is not all the preceding 20 verses, the wormwood and the gall and the hewn stone and the turned hand. That's not what he's remembering. He's about to tell us what he remembered and brought hope to his heart. In my Bible, I circled verse 21 and then drew a line down to point to verse 22, 23, and 24. Look at what it says. Because he's in the pit and he's lost all hope And suddenly this ray of hope comes into his life, and his heart starts to soar. Someone has pointed out that we can live 40 days without food. We can live 8 days without water. We can live 4 minutes without air, but we can only live a few seconds without hope. And Jeremiah found hope. In the midst of all this, of being in the divine woodshed with all of the people of God, he finds hope. And here are 3 things that he finds. You might want to keep track of them. Number 1, God's mercies never cease. Do you see it in verse 22? He says, through the Lord's mercies, we are not consumed. That's some really good news. Through the Lord's mercies, we are not consumed. Let that seep into your busy mind. If you read Psalm 23, without the perspective of the sheep, you don't really understand Psalm 23. I think we need to read Psalm 23 wrapped in wool. What's the first line? The Lord is my what? Shepherd. He's my shepherd. I'm his sheep. And then what is really amazing, some of you may know this, did you know that the Lord God has some sheepdogs? Did you know? Their names are in verse 6 of Psalm 23. Where in verse 6 it says, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. They're the 2 sheepdogs. One dog named Mercy, one dog named Goodness. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And so when I get off the path, when I start to stray, I can look over my right shoulder, here comes goodness. And I can look over my left shoulder, and here comes mercy. They follow me wherever I go. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. That's what Jeremiah is learning here. God's mercies never cease. Through his mercies we are not consumed. A second thing he learns here in verse 22, God's compassions never fail. Do you see it? His compassions fail not. The word compassion in Hebrew is a word that means sympathetic love or concern for the helpless, and it always includes involvement when it refers to God. His compassions never fail. His heart is always going out after that wayward child. That's the father heart of God. You remember the story that Jesus told in Luke 15 about the prodigal son. Do you remember that story? The younger son comes to the father and says, give me the portion of the inheritance that belongs to me because I want to go out and party. And so the father let him go. Let him stray. Let him go into the far country. And there in the far country, he wasted it on wine and women and song. And as long as he had money, he had friends. But as soon as the money ran out, what happened to his friends? They left also. And he finds himself so hungry, so devastated, that the only job he could find was slopping pigs. Imagine a Jewish boy who had been heir to an estate is now feeding pigs. And Jesus says that he is so famished, he's so hungry that he's looking at the slop that the pigs are eating, and his mouth starts to water. And he thinks about getting down and feeding alongside those sows. And then he comes to himself, and he decides to go home. And when he comes home, as he approaches his home, off in the distance, he sees an older man pulling up his robe and running down the road. It's his father. And the father says, go get the robe that belongs on my son. Go get the ring and put it on his finger. Go get new sandals for his feet and go kill the fatted calf. We're going to have a barbecue tonight. Because my son who was lost is now found. He was dead and he's alive again. That is exactly what Jeremiah is anticipating right here. God's compassions never fail. They are always there. When we come home, he always just says, I've missed you. It's good to have you home. The third thing that I see here is God's faithfulness never diminishes. It never melts away. We sing about it. Lamentations 3:23 says, great is your faithfulness. They're always great. God's faithfulness is always great. Even when you blow it, even when you blow it. Even when your marriage fails, even when your marriage fails. Even when your business goes bankrupt, even when you knew better and you did it anyway, even when you knew better and you sinned anyway, his faithfulness never diminishes. It's always great. Even when you cannot hear the voice of God, it is nearer to you than your own breath. C.S. Lewis found this to be true, by the way, towards the end of that essay he wrote in A Grief Observed. Let me read this last bit to you. He says, I have gradually been coming to feel that the door is no longer shut and bolted. Was it my own frantic need that slammed it in my face? The time when there is nothing at all in your soul except for a cry for help may just be the time when God can't give it to you. You're like a drowning man who can't be helped because he clutches and grabs. Perhaps your own reiterated cries deafen you to the voice you hope to hear. But come it does. And the voice whispers into our souls, once our thrashing abates, a voice that would say, I know your name. I know where you live. I know what you're going through. Would you allow me to give you one word? Well, actually, 5 words for you to take away. Here they are. Trust God to remember you. Trust God to remember you. He will not forget your name. There's not a time in your existence when the Father is so busy that when he hears about your travail, that he has to say, hey, Gabriel, bring me the file. Bring the file on Jerry Thornhill. I've forgotten what's going on there. He never does that. He knows your name. He knows your address. He knows the darkness of your heart that you've not told anybody about. He knows what keeps you up at night. He knows. Trust God to remember you. Great is his faithfulness. I've told you this story before. I can't help it. First of all, I want to apologize to Dan in advance for what this might do to his heart. But when I was growing up, I had a dog. And her name was Heidi. She was a boxer. I have 2 boxers now. But Heidi was my first dog that was mine. And a boxer are known for their loyalty and they're known for their silliness, but they're not known for their brains. But Heidi was a beautiful dog, and she was my best friend. We would go hunting together, squirrel hunting and rabbit hunting. She never caught anything. In fact, the only thing she ever caught was a porcupine. And I don't know if you know what would it look like for a boxer and a porcupine to meet. But let me just say the boxer always loses that fight. But we would watch grainy, gray, black and white pictures of gun smoke, all the family in the living room, and I'd be laying on the floor, and she was my pillow. We were the best of friends, Heidi. I went away for a few weeks, and when I was gone, I came back after about 3 weeks for something, and as we approached the house, I asked my mom, I said, do you think Heidi will miss me? And of course my mom said, oh, I'm sure she will. I'm sure she will. the closer we got, I missed my dad, I missed my mom, I missed my brother, I missed one of my sisters. I missed a lot of things. But the one person I wanted to see first was Heidi. And when we drove up in the driveway, she was nowhere to be found. Usually she's coming, out the driveway to kind of check out who's there, and then she wasn't there, and she wasn't on the front porch where she usually sits. I got out of the car and I ran around the back, and we had a canyon that went down behind our house, and I yelled her name, nothing. I whistled, nothing. Then I looked about 300 yards away, underneath a big pine tree. I saw dirt flying. I thought, oh, porcupine. She's got a porcupine. And I whistled really loud, and I yelled her name as loud as I could. And I heard this bark. And this bark was a warning bark, like, who's that? And then I called her name again. And then it was a bark of recognition. And here she came, just galloping. Her big old red tongue looked like a scarf on a World War I biplane flapping out beside her as she just gobbled up the ground. She came running, barking and squealing. She got about from me to Phil away, and she jumped into my arms and licked me with that washcloth-sized tongue till my face was red and raw. She remembered me. If a dog will remember a boy who's been gone 3 weeks with that kind of affection, your God will always remember you. Turn, go home, and you'll find him running down the road, arms wide open for you. Lord Jesus, hear our heart this morning.